Okay, so I had intended to do this video at the end of December, beginning of January, but life gets away with you. It gets busy and it's hard to keep up. And we actually did record this. I sat down and recorded this episode with my good friend Gary Mastriano from Backyard Superheroes and often on the Upbeat. Um, and then the recording just didn't work out. Like there was something not working on his side, and it was really unfortunate. I wish I could be doing this with him, but since it's the end of it's past the end of January, it's the beginning of February. I got to get this done because I do not want to let this channel sit stagnant all year like I did most of this last year. I want to get back to doing what this brought me energy and passion and stuff like that. So what am I talking about? And I'm gonna have to use my phone here for notes. But this year I'm talking about, or what I'm talking about for right now is my favorite things from last year and my most anticipated things from 2024. Now, some of the things that were most anticipated are already happening. So I can actually tell you a little bit about how I feel about them. So let's start out with my favorite albums from 2023, my favorite musical albums. So number one is, and these are not in the order of like how much I loved them, but these are in the order of just like being my top albums. So one of the top ones here is Glenn Hansard. All that was east is west of me now. So Glenn Hansard, you may know him from he was the singer of The Frames. He went on to star in the movie The Commitments. Well, he had a supporting role in The Commitments. He was in the movie Once with Marketa Irglova, and they formed a band called The Swell Season and put out a lot of fantastic music. And then he's put out quite a bit of solo music as well. Um, this is his newest solo album, All That Was East Is West of Me Now. It's really an interesting album. I feel like it's got a lot of range. Like there's some really rockin' songs and some more of the like more folkier stuff that we've come to expect from Glenn lately. But I really do love this album. And basically, if Glenn's name is on it, I'm gonna love it forever. Glenn to me is like the John Lennon to a lot of people. Like I just think that he's a genius and a beautiful soul, and the things that he creates are remarkable to me. So Glenn Hansard, All That Was East Is West of Me Now. Really encourage you to check that one out. The next one, and so now we've had the Grammys. It's kind of crazy to talk about some of this. So this is the band that won what best alternative album of the year, and that ended up winning 4 Grammys overall. And that is Boy Genius. So, been a fan of the individual artists in Boy Genius for a long time, right? So, Boy Genius is Julian Baker, Phoebe Bridgers, and Lucy Dacus, and all three of them are absolutely phenomenal. My favorite of those three, the one that I've listened to the most, regularly, is Julian Baker. I just absolutely adore her music. But I really, really love the other two of them as well. So, Boy Genius had their first full length album come out this year called The Record. I adored that album. I played it many, many times, still listen to it quite often. And it's definitely one you should check out. And now it's a Grammy Award winner. But they also put out an EP called The Rest that came out after the record, and it kind of is like the rest of the songs they recorded during the record. It fits right in there with it. They feel like two parts of the same thing, and it's just great. Both of them absolutely brilliant, and you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't listen. Next, this is a band that I've liked for a long time, but like not wasn't really into. Like I had heard some songs and they were good. But this time I decided to pick up one of their albums kind of without knowing their music as well as I usually do when I buy an album by someone. And I loved it. So the album is the first 2 pages of Frankenstein by The National. It was a beautiful album, so good. And then I was surprised because they released a whole nother full length album called Laugh Track just before the end of the year. And so I kind of put those two together as well. But The National, absolutely brilliant. That album, first 2 pages of Frankenstein and the album Laugh Track, absolutely brilliant. I prefer first 2 pages over Laugh Track, but they're both so good. Next one, this one won a Grammy for Best Rock Album, and that's Paramore. This Is Why. It was, again, brilliant. So for Paramore, I loved Paramore when they first came out, and I kind of drifted off. Just I have musical ADHD sometimes. I start thinking about a different genre of music or something like that, and then next thing I know, the band's put out 4 albums that I haven't listened to. Um, something about the lead-off single "This Is Why" for Paramore's album really captured my attention. So I picked up the album and just fell in love with it. And then I went back and like picked up a bunch of Paramore albums, and I have loved every single one of them. And then Paramore again released another album at the end of the year, and this one was a remix album of "This Is Why," which is also brilliant. And some of the artists that are remixing those tracks or reworking them are phenomenal and surprising, I think. So my favorite is the track with Julian Baker on it. It's just brilliant. So, all right, the next album on my top albums of the year is Sufjan Stevens' Javelin. So Sufjan Stevens' Javelin is an absolutely amazing album. It's so good. Um, Sufjan is so prolific, and I think with anyone that's like that prolific, it's hard to like everything they put out. Um, and again, my musical ADHD has played a role in the fact that there are, several albums that came out that I really haven't listened to that much. But when I go back and listen to them, I generally like everything that Sufjan puts out, but they don't always hit the same. So like nothing's going to be on the level of Illinois to me because it's my favorite album by Sufjan. But there are other great albums, and this one, Javelin, is a great album. And there are several things that sort of came to light around the release of this album that I think are deeply moving. One is Sufjan's own battle with illness, and the other is the loss of his partner, um, which for the first time Sufjan was very public about. And I don't think that people have to be public about their private lives. I think that that's something that they don't owe anyone. But I will say that for Sufjan, there were so many people that had questioned his sexuality for so long, especially having come from the Christian scene, sort of with connections to the Christian scene, that for him to publicly announce that he had been in a same-sex relationship and then lost his partner was an act of bravery and an act that sort of opens the door for a lot of people to feel seen and cared for and feel like they're not alone or that they're okay. And I think that's something that is a gift that Sufjan gave the world. So the next one is this is a soundtrack and sort of two albums again, but the soundtrack and the score for A Good Person are both brilliant. The score is done by one of the Dessners from The National, and the soundtrack is put together by oh man, Zach Braff. I lost his name for just a second there. Put together by Zach Braff, and all the soundtracks that Zach Braff puts together are brilliant, and they end up being some of my favorite soundtracks. Him and Cameron Crowe, and this is no different. It's brilliant, and it's got two tracks on there sung by Florence Pugh, who a lot of people didn't know could sing, including I didn't know she could sing, but wow, she was outstanding. So highly recommend both of those. We're getting close to the end here. We've got, I'm going to do this a little bit out of the order of what's written here. I want to talk about LaVey for a second. So LaVey also won some Grammys recently. LaVey is a really interesting jazzy artist who, she's a pianist. She can play guitar. But what I first caught of her was she was playing cello in a very unique percussive way while singing these like kind of soulful, like deep alto kind of jazz songs, and I loved it. And I'm very glad to have the album Bewitched in my collection. It came out this last year, and it's amazing. And if you haven't listened to it, you should do that for sure, especially if you're a fan of jazz. She's modernizing jazz in a way that I don't feel like we've seen so much since like maybe Norah Jones. So then the next three are my sort of punk and ska selections. So it's fitting that, for one, I've got an MXPX tattoo, and MXPX's new album, Find a Way Home, is on the top 10 for me because pretty much anything MXPX does, I love. I don't know what to say. They've been one of my favorite bands since 8th grade. They always will be, and I'm a loyal person. But even if I wasn't a loyal person, it's a great album. I don't know if it's as good as the self-titled album that came out before this, but it's really great, and I love it, so I'm happy about it. The next one I'm going to talk about, I'm wearing their shirt, Blink-182. So Blink-182, I never saw them live back in the day, and I always sort of regretted that after Tom left. And I told myself if Tom ever got back with the band, I would definitely go see them. And he did, and I did. They also released a new album called One More Time. And I mean, we had a heads up on the album for a long, long time. But when it came out, gosh, it was brilliant. And I loved it. And I'm so glad that I own it. But I'll say, like, I wasn't sure I was going to buy it because there was a couple tracks that I was like, eh. And then the more I listened, the more the album grew on me. Like, it was one of those where uh, even the tracks that I wasn't as big of a fan of really grew on me the more I listened to them. So, really glad to have One More Time. And then the last album, and I think it's the last one that came out in the year that I found and kind of fell in love with, was Moonflower by Flying Raccoon Suit. So, Flying Raccoon Suit's another one of those bands that they have so many diverse, like sort of inspirations and tastes, and their music reflects that. They've got tracks on here that have like hardcore vocals. They have these, sort of folkier kind of sounds in certain tracks, things that to me were pulling more from jazz and blues and soul and, all these different genres. And then they have, these ska bangers, which, as the Rudie Librarian, of course, I'm going to support some great ska songs. So yeah, that's Flying Raccoon Suit. Those are my top 10. And, I'm definitely glad that I have each of those albums in my collection now, where they were all a great addition. So I'm going to keep going on here, and I'm going to talk about my top books of the year. So my top books of the year, we're going to start with The Marvelers by Danielle Clayton. So if I try to explain The Marvelers to people, I typically would explain it as sort of like it's Harry Potter in the sense that there's a magical school, but it's definitely more American. It's or maybe global. It's more global, I would say. It definitely deals with issues of like race and diversity in it, because one of the things that's unique about it is the Marveler school for the first time is sort of desegregating to allow this other type of magician, or wizard or witch or whatever you want to call them, which is the conjurers, and they're being allowed in. And so as our main character is sort of integrating into the school, you definitely get a feeling of like it feels like you're getting a history lesson of what it must have been like when there was the forced desegregation of American schools, and you had these very brave black people attending schools where they knew that they were going to be hated and just for who they are, and yet they were brave enough to say, me getting this education is worth it. And so, yeah, it's just great. And it's fun too, just a fun book. It's not all like issues of race and prejudice at all. That's just sort of like a subplot in there, a subtext. But the real plot is this great sort of mystery, and it's fun. It's very fun. So, a couple of nonfiction books. I've got 4 nonfiction books in a row here, actually. I have a lot of nonfiction in here this year. I'm realizing like a lot of nonfiction. But so it's called A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, Discipleship in an Instant Society by Eugene H. Peterson. So Eugene Peterson is the guy who wrote the Message version of the Bible. I love the Message version of the Bible, and everything I learn about Eugene Peterson makes me think he's just one of those guys that we were gifted with, that I think society is better the more we like pay attention to the things that he's sharing with us. So definitely a fan of that book. I read that with a couple of guys, and there was a lot to take away from it and a lot that I really enjoyed. Next book is called Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, 1999 to 2008, and that's written by Chris Payne. This book was so good. If you grew up loving emo, and I mean, we're talking all kinds of emo, right? So we're talking going back to, the Rites of Spring, Mineral, those kinds of bands, Braid, that I think most people would think of as like sort of the beginning of emo, going into the, Dashboard Confessional and Jimmy Eat World and those kind of bands, and then going all the way up to more of the like Fall Out Boy and even past that to My Chemical Romance. and on. I mean, it's the whole history, and it's so good. And I feel like I learned so much, even though I loved a lot of bands during that time. I was into a lot of bands during that time. So um, maybe one of my favorite musical books I've ever read. So I really encourage you to read it. The next one is Surrender 40 Songs, One Story by Bono. I'm going to tell you, I listened to the audiobook of this for a lot of it. And that was a gift to hear Bono kind of tell his story. There were some really deeply moving moments in that and surprising moments. Like there's a moment where they're just having vodka in his kitchen with, like, Bono and his wife are having vodka in his kitchen with, like, Mikhail Gorbachev. And you're like, oh, all right. Didn't see that coming. And there's just some scary moments too as Bono begins to become more of an altruist and an activist, and there was definitely pushback and death threats and times where he really thought like he might not survive. And this story is just a really great look into all of that. The next one is called Still: Notes on a Mid-Faith Crisis. This book came out quite a while ago, but I finally got to read it. It's by Lauren F. Winner. And so, as someone who's spent some time sort of deconstructing my faith to sort of figure out what it is I believe a little bit better, this was a really great book, and I really enjoyed it. And Lauren F. Winter is an author I've really enjoyed a lot of her writings, so I definitely recommend it. The next one is called Thirst by Varsha Bajaj. And so Thirst is a Blue Bonnet Award winner, which is a Texas Book Award. That's a big deal here. But it's this really great story of like a young girl who, you know, has these ideas of what she wants to do, but is really limited because of just sort of poverty and class struggle. And it, like in her town, it's hard to even get like clean water. And she sort of discovers that there are people that are like keeping that way, and her life becomes in danger because she knows this. And so it's sort of like, how do you make a change to better your community, to save your community from this sort of hard, this I don't know what to call it, but these people who have that are keeping the have-nots from ever having, and keep yourself safe and your family safe. How do you stand up for what you believe when it could cost you your life or cost others their lives? And how do you live your dreams in that way? And it's brilliant. Such a good book. The next one is so Thirst was a fiction book, but A Promised Land. We're back to nonfiction for a few books here. A Promised Land obviously came out quite some time ago. It's a memoir by Barack Obama, and it was really interesting. It's a long book, and I listened to a lot of it in audiobook form, partially just because I love Barack Obama's voice, but I find there's something so great about listening to a biography or autobiography as an audiobook and hearing someone tell their own story. So yeah, it's great. And it's really interesting to hear the ins and outs of the government beyond what you knew to begin with. Next book is called Doing Nothing is No Longer an Option, One Woman's Journey into Everyday Anti-Racism. So this book was written by actually a friend of mine's wife, Jenny Booth Potter. She's an activist. She's been helping, working with Austin Channing Brown, and Austin Channing Brown, brilliant. I've loved her book as well, and so they're friends who I believe met in college, along with that's I think where she met her husband as well, and they are, and the book is basically about like, okay, how do you learn to start doing something? Like it's one thing to know that racism exists, but it's another thing to be like, I need to be a part of stopping it. And how do I do that? And to know that you're in this privileged space, and that when you step into this type of activism, that you're relinquishing some of that privilege. It sounds like it's not a big deal, but it's a scary thing. And I think that she does a really good job of kind of talking about some steps to take, how to get started on the journey. The book is beautiful. I was moved to tears in a couple of parts, and I think everyone should read it. The next one is a graphic memoir called The High Desert by James Spooner. And if you haven't yet, you should listen to the podcast episode I did where I interviewed James. He's a very, very nice guy. And James's book deals with the idea of him being a young black man coming into his identity primarily through his love of punk music, but feeling like an outsider as a black punk, and then also feeling like an outsider just as a black person in this sort of small, racist town that he lived in California. And it's very powerful in the way that it deals with race and identity, and the way that it deals with just that feeling of not being enough of something. Like, I'm too black to be punk, but maybe too punk to be black. That kind of idea is very well portrayed in this graphic memoir. And it sounded like there may be some sort of a TV show or something coming out of this here in the future, so something to look forward to. And the last one is a graphic novel called Invisible by Christina Diaz-Gonzalez, also a Bluebonnet Award winner. And this one is like a group of 5 Hispanic teens who all sort of get like a type of detention or get asked to do some they get asked to do some work in the cafeteria to make up for something like community service. And some of them it's a consequence, some of them they just need the community service. And what I love about this book is you have these 5 different Hispanic teens who are or Latina teens who are all very different from one another. Because living in Texas, if you're Hispanic, people are like, oh, you're Mexican. But there's so many different nations represented in the Hispanic culture, and different, dialects, personalities, interests, culture from country to country, and then within that you can have so many different personalities and so many different upbringings. And this book really looks at that, and then it looks at too like how we can see past our differences to do something well. It has in certain parts of it has like a Breakfast Club vibe, but it also is very much its own thing and very enjoyable. So that is my favorite books. All right, let's jump into podcasts. I'm moving quick here, and because I want to do another one where I tell you about the stuff I'm most looking forward to. So my favorite podcasts for the year 2023 were Magnified Pod, always going to be at the top. MagPod for life. It is a great podcast put on by a couple of guys I'm really good friends with, including the husband of Jenny Booth Potter, who I talked about earlier. And it is primarily a look at the Christian alternative scene of the 90s and 2000s, which is a scene that I grew up very immersed in. And what's great is that it's 2 people who are probably very different than they were back in the 90s and 2000s when they were listening to that music, but can still enjoy the music and also see, in some cases, like some of the really not great stuff about that scene. So I listened a lot to Norah Jones is Playing Along. So Norah Jones is Playing Along is a great podcast where Norah Jones brings on another musician, often very diversely different stylistically from and genre. And they just chat, and then they also play music together, and it's great. And there was an album that came out of that that was for sale at Record Store Day, and I'm glad to say I got a copy of, which is her sort of duets with some of these people. Next one I listened to some was Rock That Doesn't Roll, and this was another one kind of dealing with Christian music scene. Several episodes I really, really enjoyed. I didn't get as immersed in it as I did with MagPod, but I still really enjoyed it. The next one is Grapevine. Grapevine was a podcast that NBC put on about the city of Grapevine, which is very close to where I live. And before they did Grapevine, they did a podcast about Southlake. And I tell you, if you listen to these 2 podcasts, you'll understand why it can be very anxiety-inducing to live where I live right now and not, be of the same sort of political mindset and religious mindset as a lot of the people around you. And the last one I want to talk about is On the Upbeat. So, listen, I have my own podcast that deals with ska, but mine also focuses on books a lot. But my favorite ska podcast to listen to, and there's some great ones. I really encourage you to listen to In Defense of Ska. I really encourage you to listen to Checkered Past. They're both great. My favorite to listen to, besides my own, is On the Upbeat. And I will say, I don't listen to my own podcast. I just record it. But On the Upbeat is just a great podcast about ska. Matt Vest and RJ Phoenix and often Gary Mastriano have made that podcast just really enjoyable for me. And those guys have been really kind and supportive, and I just am very thankful for that podcast existing. And even we're in February of 2024 when I'm recording my favorites of 2023. I'm obviously behind, but I will say that there are so many episodes that have come out recently that I really, really love. So you should definitely check it out. All right, keep going here. Let's talk about movies. And I'm going quick. I mean, I feel like I'm just blasting through this, but I've got about 3 more categories to talk with you about 2023. So movies, my favorite movie of the year was a movie called A Good Person. And A Good Person, I've kind of talked about it briefly with the soundtrack. Written and directed by Zach Braff. When he was dating Florence Pugh, he wanted to create a movie for her to star in. And she is a star. She's a star without him. She's a star with him. She's a star in this movie. It's a beautiful story about a young woman who is about to get married. Everything's looking really great. She goes for a drive with her soon-to-be sister-in-law and her sister-in-law's husband, and is in a terrible car accident, and they don't make it. And she receives a head injury, and her engagement sort of falls apart. She becomes addicted to her pain pills, and she sort of has to reckon with all the pain of everything that's happened. Morgan Freeman plays as the father of her ex-fiance, who also is a recovering addict, in his case alcoholism, and they sort of become a type of friends in a way, but it's just a very painful, beautiful story at the same time. So that was my favorite movie of the year. Second favorite movie was Barbie. What's not to love about Barbie? I mean, I love that movie. I love the way it portrays, sort of toxic masculinity, and looks at like the power of women and how and the respect that they deserve. And it's not what I expected from a Barbie movie, but it was great. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse would be my third. Great movie. I love Spider-Man. I love the Spider-Verse cartoon movies, animated movies. They're so well done and so interesting. And now introducing Spider-Punk, who is a character I've always loved as a punk rocker and a Spider-Man fan. It was great to have. I wish it wasn't this sort of like cliffhanger into the third movie, but I'm looking forward to the third movie. There were 2 documentaries that I watched for the first time. They were older. One of them is Miss Sharon Jones, which came out in 2016, which follows Sharon Jones from the band Sharon Jones and the Dap Kings, kind of in their sort of rise as a band, but also at the same time dealing with Sharon's, cancer, and how do we go forward as a band in the midst of that. Having a family member that's been battling cancer for a long time, there was a lot of really touching moments in that documentary that resonated with me personally. And the last documentary, so this is my 5th movie. I only have 5 movies. Just like I only had 5 podcasts. My 5th movie is The Camino Voyage. Camino Voyage is a journey that sometimes people will take in a rowboat, and so they leave Ireland and they row all the way to, I think, Spain is where they end up. And it's harrowing at times to be in this little bitty rowboat in the middle of the vast ocean. But also in the midst of this documentary, we have Glenn Hansard, who I already told you is in many ways like my John Lennon, and he is on this voyage, and it's great. It's beautiful. It's a fantastic movie, and it definitely makes you kind of process a little bit of like, what do I value in life and why? So, all right, we've got 2 categories left. TV shows. I'm going to go very fast through TV shows. Sabrina and Chef. Sabrina Gomez learning how to cook. There have been several seasons of this. She did a holiday special season this year, which was really fun. And this was the first time that the chefs were like showing up and cooking with her, which I really enjoyed. Reacher season 2, pretty violent, but very enjoyable. Definitely a good show. I wasn't done when the year ended. I'm done now, and I loved it. So, Blackish. We have been binge watching Blackish. We're still binge watching it. We're in season 4, but we watched through the first 3 seasons, and we love it. My daughter, for those who don't know, I have 2 children who we adopted, and they're black. And so we definitely try to make sure that we engage with media that celebrates their blackness and helps them to see themselves and love themselves for who they are. And my daughter picked up on one of the personality traits of the grandmother character, and so she will now from time to time say, "Oh, Black Jesus," and it's so adorable, and I love hearing that from her. It just and she knows she's funny when she's doing it, which is what you get from that show. But that show also deals with some really serious issues, and we really appreciate that about the show. Top Chef season 20 was at the very beginning of the year last year, but we loved it. We're huge Top Chef fans and always will be. And Ahsoka, my favorite Star Wars character in live action, played by Rosario Dawson, one of my favorite actresses. Show was great all the way around. One of the best things Star Wars has put out. Definitely recommend it. So let's talk about some of my favorite events that happened in 2023. So went to the Blink-182 concert, which I talked about with Turnstile opening. Blink-182 was amazing. Huge spectacle, giant inflatable floating things, just and fun. And also these touching moments. This moment where Mark kind of talked about dealing with his, cancer and thinking he wasn't going to survive and wondering why did all this stuff that had divided him from other people before matter. And that was Mark. I think I may have said Tom, but Mark was dealing with all that. And then Tom, sort of talking about knowing that the only thing that mattered was getting back together with his friend. It's very special. Also went to see Death Cab for Cutie in the Postal Service for the 20th anniversary of Transatlanticism and Give Up. And they were both great albums. An extra special thing of having Jenny Lewis playing with the Postal Service just like she did on the album. Such a good concert all the way through, both bands, and I'm so glad I got to go to that concert. Death Cab for Cutie has been one of my favorite bands for a long, long time. It was awesome. I worked in the public library during the summer, and I may do that again this summer, but I really enjoyed my time working in the public library. I learned a lot, it paid well, and I made some great friends, and it's paid off professionally this year as my school's been able to work with the Hearst Public Library on a number of occasions. So my vinyl collection's been growing. That's great. Sometimes maybe more than it should, but it brings me a lot of joy. And I went to my first record store day, did that on Black Friday. I've talked about that in the video with my November record haul, and it was a really good time. So definitely enjoyed that. And then I recorded 3 episodes of the podcast kind of late in 2023, one with Flying Raccoon Suit, one with Mike Herrera from MXPX, and one from James Spooner. And it was so much fun, and I'm so proud of those guests. And so, yeah. So that's 2023, man. I just blasted through 6 categories of entertainment in 32 minutes. And I am looking forward to doing the same with the stuff I was looking forward to in 2024. Won't be quite as much to talk about because there's a lot you don't know going into 2024, but I do look forward to talking about it. So we're going to transition and we're going to jump right back into that.